November 8th, 2018, Paradise, California. Both sides of the street were already on fire when a woman grabbed the hand of a stranger standing beside her. The sky had been black for hours, even though the sun had been up the whole time. "Have you lived a good life?" she asked him. He said he had. "So have I," he answered. His name was Nordgren, president of the Paradise Lutheran Church Council. "We're going to say the Our Father," he told her, "and we're going to drive like hell." They made it out. Thousands of others that morning were not so lucky. By the time the fire finally stopped burning, 85 people were dead. A town of nearly 27,000 people had been reduced to ash in under a day. It remains the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history. And the fire didn't start from lightning or a careless campfire or an act of nature at all. It started from a single piece of failing electrical equipment owned by one of the largest utility companies in the country. Equipment that same company would later admit, in a courtroom, under oath, it had failed to properly maintain. Pacific Gas and Electric would eventually plead guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter. 84 separate human beings, each one a name, a face, a life, killed by a transmission line that should have been replaced years before it finally gave way. This is the story of the morning an entire town disappeared, told through the people who were actually there. Butte County, California had been locked in drought for years by 2018. The hills around Paradise, a quiet retirement community tucked into the Sierra Nevada foothills, were covered in dry brush and timber that hadn't seen meaningful rain in months. At around 6:15 in the morning, near a remote spot called Polga, a metal C-hook holding up a transposition jumper on PG&E's Caribou-Palermo transmission line finally gave way. Investigators would later determine that hook, worn down after decades of use, had not received a close climbing inspection in at least 17 years. When it failed, the line dropped and struck the steel tower beneath it, throwing molten metal directly into the dry vegetation below. What happened next moved faster than almost anyone could process in real time. Offshore winds were gusting up to 50 miles per hour that morning, funneled and accelerated by the exact shape of the Feather River Canyon the fire had ignited inside. The flames covered 7 miles in just 90 minutes. Fire crews were already reporting structures burning inside the town of Paradise a little over 90 minutes after that single hook first failed, a speed of spread that outran almost every evacuation plan the region had ever prepared for. By the time evacuation orders went out, the fire wasn't approaching Paradise anymore. It was already inside the town limits. Only one main road led out, Skyway, and within the hour it became a single, terrifying bottleneck. Thousands of cars trying to funnel down the same 2-lane road while flames closed in from both sides at once. 93-year-old Dorothy Lee Herrera lived on the eastern edge of town. She managed to leave a voicemail for her son before the phone lines went down. "There's a fire," her voice said. "We've got to get out." It was one of the last messages her family would receive from her that morning. Not everyone had a way out. Andrew Downer was 54 years old, a wheelchair-bound amputee who had lost his leg to diabetes years earlier, unable to drive himself anywhere. His caregiver, Cindy McDonald, called him that morning to warn him the fire was coming and offered to come get him. He said no. His dogs didn't want to leave, and he didn't want to abandon a house filled, floor to ceiling, with the marble collections, crystals, antiques, and odd little treasures he'd spent a lifetime gathering. Friends would later describe him as loud, generous, endlessly fun to be around. He was found afterward outside his own front door, close enough that investigators believe he had, at the very last moment, tried to make it out after all. Rose Farrell was 99 years old. She was found on her own front porch, her wheelchair sitting empty beside her. Robert Duvall, 76, made it into his truck and got a third of a mile from his house before the fire caught him. Nearby, in a second vehicle, investigators found the remains of his girlfriend, Beverly Powers. They hadn't even managed to leave in the same car. Paul Ernest and his wife tried something different, driving their ATV off-road through a canyon, hoping to outrun the flames along a path the fire wouldn't think to follow. Their route was blocked by a rock formation they couldn't get around. The fire caught up to them there. Both were severely burned, and airlifted to a hospital burn unit hours away. Paul's wife survived. Paul held on for nearly 9 months before he finally succumbed to his injuries, becoming, in the most painful, delayed way imaginable, one more name added to the fire's final count. Randall Dodge, 66, and his wife Paula tried to make it to their cars together. They were found afterward between the two vehicles in their own driveway, close enough to each other that investigators believe they'd been trying until the very last moment to reach one another rather than escape alone. Rafaela Andrade was 84 years old and could not walk without a walker. There was no realistic version of that morning in which she could have evacuated on her own. And by the time anyone who might have helped her realized how little time was actually left, the roads around her home were already gone. Not every elderly resident who stayed behind was unable to leave. Don Criswell, a Paradise native, made the deliberate choice to stay and fight the fire himself rather than evacuate. One of a small number of residents who gambled everything on defending the town, or at least their own small piece of it, with whatever they had on hand. He survived. 66-year-old Calvin Daly had lived in the area since 1970 and had already seen 6 or 7 fires come through in his lifetime. He decided to stay behind and defend his home himself, while his wife, unable to get back from her job in Oroville once the roads closed, spent the day not knowing if he was alive. "We had fire protection," he said afterward, "but this time around, this firestorm that came through, the firefighters could not stand and defend that." He made it. His house, somehow, did too. A 93-year-old World War II veteran named Lee Brundage drove himself out of Paradise in his own car, alone, one of the only ways he had left of getting out at all. A couple, Josh Fox and Tracy Grant, met him later that day while they were driving around handing out hamburgers to displaced residents with nowhere to go. They offered him a place to stay. At first, fiercely independent, he refused and slept that first night in his own car instead, wrapped in blankets and a pillow they'd given him. Eventually, he accepted their offer. His home, the one his late wife had designed herself years before, had already burned to the ground by the time anyone thought to check. Inside Feather River Hospital, one of the only medical facilities serving the entire town, staff faced their own impossible morning. With the fire already closing in and evacuation routes narrowing by the minute, a nurse got behind the wheel of a delivery truck, not an ambulance, just whatever vehicle happened to be available, and drove it straight through active flame to get patients out of a building that was about to become unreachable by any normal route at all. On Skyway itself, the only road most of Paradise had to escape by, the bottleneck became so complete that some drivers eventually abandoned their vehicles outright and ran on foot instead, deciding that moving through smoke and falling embers on their own 2 feet gave them better odds than sitting still in a line of cars that wasn't moving at all. At least one bulldozer operator spent part of that morning doing something no evacuation plan had ever anticipated needing: physically pushing abandoned, burning cars off the roadway so the vehicles still moving, the ones with people still inside them, could actually get through. By 2018, California had already spent much of the decade cycling between severe drought and brief, inadequate wet seasons, a pattern that left forests and grasslands across the northern part of the state carrying far more dry, dead fuel than they would have in a normal year. Fire scientists had been warning for years that this combination, prolonged drought stress plus aging, poorly maintained electrical infrastructure running directly through some of the most fire-prone terrain in the country, was a disaster waiting for a single point of failure to set it off. Nobody could say exactly which hillside, which tower, or which morning. On November 8, 2018, all 3 of those unknowns were finally answered at once. Daily celebrating was the same kind of dry, offshore gust event that has become one of the most feared weather patterns in California fire season. Air pushed down out of the mountains and compressed as it funnels through canyons, arriving hot, bone dry, and fast enough to turn a contained, manageable fire into something no amount of manpower could realistically outrun. Firefighters who responded that morning described conditions unlike almost anything in their careers. Embers thrown hundreds of yards ahead of the main fire line, igniting new spot fires faster than any crew could physically reach them, turning what should have been a fight along a single front into dozens of separate fires breaking out simultaneously across an area far larger than any department could realistically cover with the resources on hand that day. Some firefighters who worked the campfire have since described a specific, particular helplessness that stayed with them long after the flames were out. Arriving at a home, a street, an entire neighborhood already fully engulfed, with no water pressure left to fight it, and no realistic path to save what was already gone, forced to redirect toward the next place that might still be savable instead. It's a version of triage most people never have to think about, deciding in real time which fires you can still stop and which ones you simply have to let finish, and living afterward with the knowledge of exactly which doors you didn't get to. By the end of 2018, insurance analysts and disaster researchers would rank the campfire as the single costliest natural disaster anywhere in the world that entire year, a distinction that had nothing to do with an earthquake, a hurricane, or a war, and everything to do with one small piece of failing hardware on a hillside almost nobody outside Butte County had ever heard of before that morning. Entire neighborhoods that residents had lived in for decades simply stopped existing. Street signs melted. Cars were found abandoned in driveways, engines still running, doors left open, their owners having made it only a few feet before deciding to run on foot instead. Search and rescue crews working through the wreckage in the days that followed described a task unlike almost anything in modern American disaster response, an entire town's worth of ground to cover, much of it reduced so completely to ash that locating remains required specially trained cadaver dogs working alongside forensic anthropologists, since in many cases there was simply nothing else left to identify a person by. Joyce Aitchison had spent decades as a piano teacher in Paradise, patient by her former students' own accounts, even with the ones who tried to get away with murder on their scales. She had limited mobility. The road to her home had already been closed off by the time anyone tried to reach her. She was found inside. Herbert Alderman, 80 years old, had a badly sprained ankle that morning, bad enough that walking any real distance wasn't an option. He made call after call to friends, asking for a ride out. Nobody reached him in time. He was found inside his home as well. Teresa Ammons, 82, had come to Paradise with her husband years earlier and settled into a mobile home community on Pence Road, one of the hardest hit stretches in the entire fire. She tried to run. She was found outside her trailer, her purse still on the ground beside her, as if she'd grabbed it on her way out the door and simply hadn't gotten any farther than that. In the days immediately after the fire, the list of the missing swelled to well over 1,000 names, a number that terrified the entire state before investigators and family members slowly, painstakingly worked it down toward the final confirmed total. For those 1,000+ families, every single day the list stayed unresolved meant another day of not knowing, refreshing news updates, calling hospitals and shelters, hoping a name would move from one column to the other before it was too late to matter which column it landed in. For the survivors who did make it out, the fire didn't end the moment they crossed the town line. Displaced residents scattered across California in the weeks that followed, some staying with relatives, some in hotel rooms paid for by relief funds, some in tents and cars parked in Walmart lots and church gymnasiums that had converted themselves into shelters almost overnight.
Children changed schools mid-semester. Longtime neighbors who had lived 2 houses apart for 30 years found themselves scattered 100 miles in different directions, uncertain when or whether the community they'd known would ever exist in the same shape again. By the time the fire was finally contained, more than 2 weeks later, it had destroyed over 18,000 structures, the vast majority of them homes. A town of nearly 27,000 residents had, in a span of a single catastrophic morning, effectively ceased to exist as a functioning community. The last of the 85 confirmed dead, 80-year-old Larry Smith, was taken off life support nearly 3 weeks after the fire first started, dying not in the flames themselves, but from the injuries they'd left behind, becoming, weeks after everyone assumed the counting was finished, one more name on a list nobody wanted to keep adding to.
In the aftermath, investigators traced the fire's origin back to that single failed hook on Tower 27/222, and to a maintenance record showing PG&E had not sent a climber up to closely inspect that exact piece of hardware in at least 17 years. California's Public Utilities Commission would go on to cite the company for 12 separate violations of state safety law tied directly to the fire. In June 2020, Pacific Gas and Electric pleaded guilty in a Butte County courtroom to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter and 1 count of unlawfully starting a fire. The first time in modern California history that criminal manslaughter charges of this kind had ever been successfully brought against a utility company. Prosecutors and legal historians would later describe it as one of the deadliest corporate crimes ever prosecuted in the United States. The criminal fine PG&E actually paid for those 84 deaths came to $4 million, the legal maximum allowed. A number that, set beside 84 human lives, tells its own quiet story about the limits of what criminal law can actually do to a company of that size. The far larger reckoning came through civil settlements instead. Facing more than $30 billion in total wildfire liability and forced into bankruptcy, PG&E eventually agreed to a $13.5 billion settlement covering victims of the Camp Fire, alongside several other fires its equipment had started in 2017 and 2018, compensation eventually reaching roughly 70,000 claimants in total. The town of Paradise itself received $270 million. Butte County received $252 million. Attorney Erin Brockovich, already well known for her own decades-long fight against corporate negligence, joined the legal effort, representing thousands of the fire's victims, lending a familiar face to a case that, for many residents, still felt impossible to fully reckon with in dollar terms alone. Paradise itself has slowly, painfully begun to rebuild in the years since, a fraction of its former population trickling back into a landscape still visibly scarred by what happened there. Some who left have said they'll never come back, the town they knew existing now only in memory and in old photographs. Others rebuilt on the exact same lots where their old homes once stood, unwilling to let one catastrophic morning be the final word on a place they'd spent decades calling home. But the story of the Camp Fire was never really about the buildings, or even about the billions of dollars eventually paid out in settlements and fines. It was about Andrew Downer refusing to leave his dogs and his lifetime of small, strange treasures. It was about a 99-year-old woman found on her own porch, wheelchair beside her, having simply run out of time to reach it. It was about Randall and Paula Dodge, found between 2 cars in their own driveway, having tried until the very last possible second to reach each other rather than save themselves alone.
It was about a church council president named Nordgren grabbing a stranger's hand in the middle of a burning street, asking her if she'd lived a good life, telling her they were going to say the Lord's Prayer and drive like hell. And somehow, against every odd stacked against them that morning, actually making it out alive together. 85 people did not get that same ending. Every one of them had a name, a home, a morning that started out looking completely ordinary, right up until the moment a single worn piece of metal on a hillside they'd never visited finally gave way. If this story affected you the way it affected us putting it together, let us know in the comments. We read every single one. And if someone in your life lived through the campfire, we'd genuinely like to hear that story too. If you want more deep, human-focused disaster history like this, subscribe and hit like. It helps more than you'd think. This has been Beyond Impact. We'll see you in the next one.